The humid air hung heavy over the jungle clearing, thick with the smell of wet earth and smoke from distant fires. The American soldiers, disoriented and bruised from the ambush that had cost them their freedom, trudged forward with a mixture of fatigue and disbelief etched into their faces. Their eyes, still adjusting to the daylight after a long night of forced marches and cramped confinement, widened at the sight before them. Barbed wire fences twisted into jagged patterns like metallic thorns, enclosing a patchwork of crumbling barracks that leaned at impossible angles, as if time itself had given up on them. Guard towers loomed overhead, silhouettes of armed men etched sharply against the burning sky, their rifles ready, their eyes unyielding. Every footstep on the rough, uneven ground echoed like a judgment, each snap of a branch underfoot a reminder of the fragility of human life in this place. The prisoners' first thoughts were of escape, of resistance, but hope was a fleeting shadow here. Their hands, once steady and capable, trembled as hunger gnawed at the edges of their willpower. Rumors had preceded them, stories whispered among the captured from other units, tales of meager rations, disease, and cruelty. But nothing could have prepared them for this. A few of the soldiers, those with eyes trained for survival, scanned the camp with mechanical precision. They noted the patrolling guards, the meager piles of firewood, the stench rising from latrines too few in number and far too close to the living quarters. A harsh wind carried the faint metallic tang of blood and rust from some distant, unseen wound, an unspoken warning of the suffering that awaited them. Those who had been hardened by previous battles felt a familiar tightening in the chest, the instinctive pull to endure, but the younger, untested men froze, their minds caught between fear and disbelief. They were corralled into the camp. The realization sank in like a stone dropped into cold water. Survival here would not be decided by courage alone or by skill in battle. The most immediate, most merciless threat was scarcity itself. The prisoners were told, briefly, curtly, that food would be rationed, just enough to keep them alive, but even as the words left the lips of the guards, there was no convincing warmth in the tone, no promise of mercy. For the Americans who had been raised on abundance, who had known the comfort of steady meals and full stomachs, the notion that rats and weeds might become their sustenance was inconceivable. Yet it would be this harsh, unyielding reality that would define their days, their nights, and the very edge of their humanity. Some men whispered quietly among themselves, comparing stories from previous battles, seeking comfort in shared knowledge, but the air was thick with tension. Every glance toward the guards, every shuffle of feet, was a reminder that any misstep could lead to punishment, or worse. And still, the soldiers could not stop themselves from staring at the barracks, wondering how so many men could live and die in such conditions. The walls, splintered and scarred, seemed to absorb the weight of human suffering, the shadows within hiding stories that would never be fully told. Letters later recovered from the men would describe that first day in haunted, almost ritualistic language. "We were animals before we were men," one wrote, "herded like sheep, yet no one dared cry. Our stomachs clenched, our bodies ached, but the mind raced faster than it ever had, searching, calculating, fearing." It was here, amid the squalor and the silent threat of death, that the true challenge of captivity began. The war was no longer fought with bullets, but with survival itself, and every meal, or the lack thereof, was a battle, won or lost. They would soon learn, in the coming days and weeks, that the human body is capable of remarkable endurance and yet equally capable of despair. Every whisper of wind through the wire fences, every shriek of a distant animal, and every glance from a guard became part of a grim, relentless rhythm. This was the introduction, the first chapter in a story of shock and survival, where rats and weeds were not mere pests or plants, they were lifelines. The evening sun slanted across the camp, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to twist and crawl along the ground. Hunger was already gnawing at the prisoners' bellies, a persistent, aching reminder that survival was no longer theoretical. It was urgent, pressing, immediate. When the guards finally corralled the men into the central mess area, the American soldiers were met with the sight of their first meal, and the shock was immediate. What was handed to them were tin bowls, scalding hot, filled with a watery broth that smelled faintly of weeds, mud, and despair. Floating within the soup were scraps of vegetables so thinly sliced and so overcooked that they seemed more like shadows than sustenance. A collective silence fell over the men. Some raised their bowls hesitantly, as though testing whether they were part of some cruel illusion. Others, already consumed by hunger, dipped their spoons in and recoiled immediately. The taste was bitter, metallic, something between damp soil and rusted iron. A soldier later wrote in his diary, "It wasn't food, it was a mockery of food. Our stomachs twisted at the thought that this was meant to sustain us, and yet there was nothing else." For many of the younger men, who had grown up with kitchens full of variety and refrigerators packed with enough to last a week, the realization was staggering. Their bodies had been conditioned to expect abundance, to take for granted the simple act of eating, and now, in the grim, gray shadows of this camp, they were being forced to confront the most primal reality. Hunger could kill faster than any bullet, and the body would demand sustenance, regardless of how unpalatable it might be. Some men tried to find humor in it, a psychological shield against despair. One soldier, in a low whisper to his bunkmate, remarked that the soup might be improved if they added a pinch of their own imagination. Others laughed nervously, the sound breaking through the oppressive quiet, but even the humor was thin and brittle, offering no real comfort. What they needed was nourishment, not distraction, and the camp offered neither. It was here that the first seeds of survival ingenuity began to take root. While the soup was barely enough to dull the edge of hunger, men began talking in hushed tones about what else they might eat. Rats, once reviled, became a topic of cautious speculation. Edible weeds, previously ignored or considered worthless, were eyed with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The concept of eating such things was revolting, but in the silent, haunted gazes of their fellow prisoners, revulsion was secondary to survival. The meal itself, meager as it was, became a test, not just of endurance, but of moral boundaries. Soldiers wrestled internally with the question of how far they could go to stay alive. Could they really kill and eat a rat? Could they stomach wild greens that smelled of dirt and decay? Even among hardened veterans, these questions carried a weight that no battlefield had ever imposed. One diary entry, written in trembling script after that first evening meal, captures the horror and disbelief. We stared at the bowls as though they contained poison. Some of us ate, some of us did not. I watched a man next to me take a spoonful and gag, tears running down his face. Yet he ate again, because what choice did he have? We were not prisoners of men alone, we were prisoners of hunger, and it was relentless. By the time the sun had fully set, painting the camp in a bruise-colored twilight, the soldiers had begun to understand the cruel arithmetic of survival here. One bowl of soup, a few scraps of overcooked greens, or the eventual capture of a small, trembling rat might mean the difference between life and death. And the starkest truth was sink in. No one had ever prepared them for this. The first few days in the camp passed in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. Hunger, once a background sensation, had become a constant, gnawing presence. Every step was heavier, every breath a little more labored. The American soldiers quickly realized that this was not merely a test of endurance, it was an unrelenting assault on the body and mind. Their muscles ached, swollen joints protested, and eyes once bright with defiance grew hollow and haunted. Each man became painfully aware of the sharp distinction between the life they had known and the life that now consumed them. Letters recovered years later speak of the relentless mental toll. "We counted each hour between meals as if it were a century," one soldier wrote. "Every pang of hunger was a drumbeat in a funeral march for our bodies. We were not prisoners only of the Japanese guards, but of our own stomachs, which had become tyrants, commanding fear and desperation." Starvation, it seemed, was a weapon far more effective than any gun. It gnawed at dignity, it clouded judgment, and it blurred the lines between desperation and morality. As the days dragged on, the soldiers discovered the horrifying truths of malnutrition. Shaking hands, dizzy spells, and fainting spells became commonplace. Skin turned pallid, hair thinned, and the once proud faces of young men aged almost overnight. Those who tried to maintain a facade of strength found themselves collapsing in the shadows of the barracks, too weak even to speak. Medical care, such as it was, consisted of scrawled instructions or half-hearted remedies, leaving illness to progress unchecked. The psychological effects were equally harrowing. Men reported hallucinations, seeing food where there was none, imagining rivers of milk or tables overflowing with bread. Sleep offered no respite. It was filled with dreams of grazing fields, bustling kitchens, and the warm comfort of a full belly, images that mocked their present reality. One soldier later reflected, "I dreamed of a sandwich so vividly that I could taste the mustard. When I awoke, the hunger was a blade, sharper than before." Even simple decisions became monumental. When rations were split, arguments arose over who would receive the slightly larger portion. What had once been unthinkable, stealing scraps from a fellow prisoner or eating food reserved for someone else, became a grim calculation of survival. Some men began to trade favors or offer labor in exchange for even a single bite of vegetables. The camp had created an ecosystem of desperation where every act, no matter how small, was a negotiation with hunger itself. Starvation also heightened the soldiers' awareness of the natural world, forcing them to reconsider what was edible, what was nourishing, and what could keep them alive. Weeds, roots, and even insects became items of discussion, trial, and sometimes reluctant consumption. Each choice carried risk. Some plants caused illness, some insects were poisonous, and some methods of preparation were crude at best. Yet slowly, with careful observation and whispered counsel from older prisoners, the men began to adapt, learning the brutal curriculum of survival under the most extreme conditions. This stage of captivity also revealed the paradoxical nature of hope. Small victories, a piece of vegetable, a captured rat, a hot sip of water, were celebrated as though they were heroic achievements. Even in the depths of starvation, camaraderie offered a fragile shield against despair. Men shared what little they had, whispered encouragement, and recited memories of home and loved ones, drawing strength from the bonds of shared suffering. These moments, rare and fleeting, contrasted sharply with the constant, punishing reality of hunger. By the end of the first week, the prisoners' bodies were already beginning to betray them. Muscle mass dwindled, stomachs hardened from malnutrition, and every step required deliberate effort. Starvation was no longer an abstract threat. It was an inescapable, omnipresent force, dictating every thought, every action, and every moment of consciousness. And yet, amid the relentless deprivation, the human will to survive persisted, quietly, stubbornly, waiting for the first opportunity to claim victory over despair. The first time a rat scuttled across the floor of the barracks, it was met with startled screams and nervous laughter. In a normal world, it would have been dismissed as a nuisance, an unwelcome pest to be chased away or ignored. But in this camp, under the oppressive weight of hunger, it became a symbol of both revulsion and hope. The soldiers, driven by desperation, quickly realized that these small, trembling creatures might be the difference between life and death. The transition from fear to necessity was almost instantaneous, and the moral boundaries they had once taken for granted began to blur. Catching a rat was not easy. The men fashioned crude traps from tin cans, scraps of cloth, and whatever bits of string they could scavenge. Some would use bait, stale bread or leftover vegetables, but others relied on sheer cunning, patience, and a steady hand. There was a silent, unspoken ritual to this activity. The men spoke little, their eyes fixed, their movements precise. Failure could mean weeks without additional nourishment, and yet the act itself, though necessary, was profoundly humiliating. Cooking the rats presented a separate challenge. Firewood was scarce, and the risk of burning or undercooking meat was high. Some prisoners boiled the rats in whatever liquid they could find, while others roasted them over smoldering coals. The first bite was met with hesitation, a grimace, and sometimes outright gagging. Yet the soldiers persisted, driven by hunger and the hard-won understanding that survival was worth enduring anything, even the taste of a creature they would have once fled from. "It tasted of ash and fear," one soldier wrote years later, "but it kept me alive." The psychological impact was profound. Consuming a rat forced the prisoners to confront the extremity of their situation, to acknowledge the starkness of their reality. Many soldiers wrestled with shame, disgust, and a fleeting sense of guilt. Yet in those moments, survival instincts overpowered all else. Human ingenuity emerged under pressure. Some men would even attempt to improve the flavor, boiling the meat with a few weeds or scraps of vegetables, turning horror into necessity. Interestingly, the act of eating rats fostered a strange sense of solidarity. The prisoners who shared their catches, who dared to teach one another the safest and most efficient methods of capture and preparation, formed bonds that would last long after liberation. The shared experience of confronting fear and transforming it into sustenance created a quiet, resilient camaraderie, a lifeline amid the camp's relentless oppression. Letters and diary entries frequently highlighted this grim reality. One soldier described, "We caught what we could, shared it with those too weak to hunt, and for a few minutes each day the hunger dulled. I never thought I would shake hands with a rat and consider it a friend, but it became so in a way. Without it, some of us would not have survived to see morning." Another recalled the shock of initially eating the meat. "It felt like betrayal of everything I knew, yet also like victory over the hunger that would have killed me." The practice of eating rats also highlighted a cruel paradox. The very things that inspired fear, disgust, and revulsion became the most effective instruments of survival. While the guards patrolled, indifferent to the prisoners' ingenuity, the men quietly honed skills born of necessity, learning to trap, cook, and consume with precision and caution. Each small success was celebrated internally, often without words, a private triumph against both starvation and the dehumanizing conditions of the camp. By the end of the first month, rats had become not just food, but a symbol. They were a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the lengths to which a soldier would go to survive. Every captured rat was a small victory against the relentless oppression of hunger, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, life clung stubbornly to those determined to hold on to it. As the days stretched into weeks, the soldiers quickly realized that rats alone could not sustain them. The camp was surrounded by dense brush, scrubland, and tangled undergrowth, places once avoided as unremarkable or unpleasant. Hunger, however, transformed these neglected patches of earth into a hidden pantry, albeit one filled with uncertainty, risk, and distaste. Every leaf, root, or sprig became a potential lifeline, and the men began to explore the grim science of survival through foraging. The first attempts were tentative. Hands shook as soldiers plucked weeds from the soil, unsure whether each plant was edible or poisonous. Some tasted bitter, some metallic, some almost flavorless, yet all offered a small measure of nourishment. A handful of grass-like shoots or boiled roots could extend a soldier's day, staving off the crushing despair of an empty stomach. Survival required experimentation, courage, and a willingness to endure discomfort. "We ate what we had once pulled from our lawns as children and never thought twice about," one diary recounts. Now it was life or death. The prisoners began cataloging what they could eat. Dandelions, clover, wild spinach, even the occasional fern. Each discovery was recorded mentally, shared quietly among those desperate for sustenance. Knowledge became currency. Soldiers whispered tips about preparation, boiling certain leaves to reduce bitterness, crushing roots to release water, or combining small amounts of weeds with rat meat to make the flavor less offensive. There was a subtle ritual in these preparations, a small act of control in an environment designed to strip men of dignity and autonomy. Foraging, however, was never without danger. Venturing outside the barbed wire enclosures, even a few meters into the brush, risked punishment from guards or the exposure to poisonous plants and venomous snakes. Some men read the risks entirely, driven by the gnawing certainty that an empty stomach could kill faster than a bullet. Yet even amidst the fear, the soldiers found moments of strange beauty. The sun filtering through leaves, the delicate dew on a plant, or the quiet rustle of wildlife, all reminders that life continued, even in the shadow of death. The psychological shift was profound. Where once weeds had been seen as nuisances, they became symbols of resilience and adaptability. Soldiers described a growing respect for the small victories of survival. The discovery of an edible root after hours of searching, the satisfaction of a single leaf that could sustain them through the afternoon. These small acts of triumph, though seemingly insignificant, safeguarded morale and forged a shared sense of determination. Even in the bitterest moments, humor surfaced in whispers. One soldier wrote, "We argued over which weeds tasted better, clover or dandelion, laughing through the hunger that gnawed at our bellies. The weeds became our unlikely delicacies, the taste of which we compared like gourmets at a feast we would never have." The irony of finding sustenance in what had once been considered worthless underscored the extreme adaptation required to survive the camp. Letters and memoirs from the period often dwell on the duality of these experiences: disgust and necessity, fear and triumph, deprivation and ingenuity. The act of foraging was more than physical survival, it was mental and emotional endurance. Soldiers learned to trust their instincts, observe nature closely, and push beyond disgust to find nourishment. Every successful foraging mission was a quiet rebellion against the omnipresent scarcity imposed by the camp, a reclaiming of agency in a world designed to strip them bare. By the end of several weeks, foraging had become second nature. Soldiers no longer recoiled at the thought of eating weeds or roots. It became routine, a daily negotiation with the natural world. The once unthinkable had become essential, and with each small meal, the men preserved a fragile sense of self, holding on to the human capacity for adaptation, ingenuity, and survival. Dawn broke slowly over the camp, a muted gray light filtering through the barbed wire and the leaning, dilapidated barracks. The prisoners stirred reluctantly, bodies stiff and aching from the cold, hard ground, muscles weakened by weeks of meager rations. Hunger was no longer just a sensation, it had become a constant companion, threading through every thought, every movement, every whispered conversation. The day began not with hope, but with calculation. What could be scavenged, hunted, or shared to survive the hours ahead? Roll call was a grim affair. Soldiers lined up along the dirt paths, the skeletal forms of their companions highlighted by the morning light. The guards moved among them like predatory shadows, rifles at the ready, eyes cold and calculating. Any sign of weakness or slowness was punished, sometimes violently. The prisoners learned quickly to mask the toll of starvation, forcing stiff smiles or mechanical movements even as their stomachs churned and their legs shook. Failure to do so could mean solitary confinement, beatings, or worse. Every day, survival was measured not just by what they ate, but by what they endured without complaint. Work details provided the only semblance of purpose. Soldiers were sent to clear brush, repair fences, or haul meager supplies, each task designed to drain them further, to test the limits of their waning strength. Some men collapsed in the mud, trembling and exhausted, only to be dragged to their feet by fellow prisoners or prodded by guards. Hunger made every movement painful. Thirst intensified each ache, and yet the routine persisted. In this way, the camp enforced a rigid rhythm of suffering: labor, inspection, roll call, and the faint possibility of a meager meal. Meals themselves became events of anxiety. Even the smallest scraps, thin broth, a few leaves of boiled greens, or the occasional rat, were rationed. Carefully, portions divided with military precision. Sharing was common, but always tinged with fear. Share too much, and you risk your own survival. Share too little, and you risk the morale of the group. Soldiers learned the delicate balance of generosity and self-preservation, a constant negotiation that required both intelligence and emotional resilience. The men also developed routines to protect their fragile dignity. In the shadows of the barracks, small rituals emerged, whispering letters home in secret, carefully tending makeshift gardens of weeds, or quietly teaching one another how to catch a rat or prepare a root. These acts, seemingly minor, became anchors of identity and humanity in a world designed to strip both away. For the prisoners, routine was not just about physical survival, it was about keeping a thread of sanity intact, a reminder that they were more than hollowed-out shells. Boredom and repetition created unexpected psychological pressures. Time stretched interminably. Every hour felt like a day, every day a week. Men would count the ticks of the clock or watch the shadows creep across the barracks, their minds trapped between the relentless pain of hunger and the necessity of enduring it. Some sank into silence, staring blankly at walls, haunted by memories of home or consumed by visions of food. Others found solace in camaraderie, trading stories, sharing jokes, and maintaining a semblance of normality in a world governed by deprivation. Disease and filth compounded the suffering. Lice, dysentery, and scurvy became constant threats, each outbreak a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The men learned to be cautious, washing in the contaminated river, avoiding certain patches of mud, or sharing the most basic medical knowledge to stave off infection. These small adaptations, born of necessity, highlighted the ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit even when stripped to its most vulnerable state. Yet even amid relentless deprivation, moments of fragile hope persisted. A successful hunt, a discovered edible plant, or the camaraderie of shared misery could lift spirits for a fleeting moment. The daily routine, while harsh, was not purely mechanical. It was also a framework in which soldiers maintained control over the uncontrollable. Each small act of survival, cooking a rat, boiling a root, or simply rising to stand in line, became a victory over the cruelty of starvation and the brutality of captivity. By the third week in the camp, hunger had evolved from a physical torment into a psychological specter that haunted every thought. The men, their bodies already weakened by meager rations, now faced a new kind of battle, one waged entirely within the mind. Fear, despair, and hallucination became constant companions, each threatening to erode the fragile sense of self that remained. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams were filled with feasts and kitchens, the smells of bread and roasted meat so vivid that waking felt like a betrayal, a cruel reminder that survival had become an unending negotiation with deprivation. Soldiers reported seeing food where there was none. Shadows cast by broken boards resembled trays of vegetables, rustling leaves appeared to contain hidden fruits, and the faint smell of smoke triggered imagined kitchens from home. The hunger-induced visions, while terrifying, also offered a peculiar kind of sustenance. Mental rehearsals of meals, imagined bites that, for a moment, dulled the gnawing emptiness of their stomachs. Yet these visions were double-edged. Each hallucination ended with the cold reality of nothingness, reinforcing the hopelessness of their predicament. The constant state of deprivation also magnified fear. Guards' movements, once predictable, now appeared menacing, each glance or footstep a potential threat. Arguments over food, minor disagreements, and even accidental brushings with fellow prisoners could erupt into violence, fueled by the raw edge of starvation. The camp became a pressure cooker of tension, and mental endurance was tested as fiercely as the body itself. Many soldiers described a near-obsessive focus on food, imagining it, craving it, measuring the hours until the next meager ration with anxious intensity. Hunger transformed thought into a single-minded pursuit, squeezing out all but the most vital concerns. The emotion. All was equally devastating. Shame, guilt, and disgust became constant companions. Soldiers who consumed rats or foraged weeds grappled with moral conflict, often writing in diaries that they felt both triumph and revulsion in the same breath. "To eat a rat," one diary noted, "was to deny the man I once was, yet without it, I would not wake to see another sunrise." Survival forced a recalibration of values, where old societal norms were replaced by pragmatic necessities, and dignity became a luxury few could afford. Some men found ways to cope through mental routines. Whispered prayers, silent songs, and the sharing of memories from home created small psychological refuges. Soldiers encouraged one another with quiet nods, offering scraps of food or advice on how to make the bitter greens more palatable. Humor, though rare and brittle, emerged as a critical survival tool. Jokes about the taste of weeds or mock ceremonies over rat-catching victories allowed men to reclaim a measure of humanity in an environment determined to strip it away. Even the strongest among them were not immune to the effects of starvation-induced delirium. Hallucinations became violent for some, with men imagining enemies lurking in shadows or animals turning into predators in the dim light of the barracks. Sleep deprivation and nutritional deficiency amplified paranoia, creating a landscape where trust and perception were constantly under siege. A soldier later reflected, "I could not tell what was real anymore. The hunger spoke louder than the guards, louder than the barracks, louder than anything. It was a voice I could not silence." Despite the relentless psychological strain, resilience persisted in unexpected forms. Shared suffering forged bonds stronger than any food could provide. Men who might have fought over scraps found themselves sharing the last bite of boiled weeds or dividing a captured rat, sustaining not only the body but the spirit. These moments, small yet profound, revealed the astonishing capacity of humans to adapt to extremes, to find moral and emotional anchors even in the shadow of starvation. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the battle for survival was as much about mastering the mind as the body. Hunger, relentless and insidious, had stripped the men bare, yet it had also revealed their ingenuity, their stubbornness, and their capacity to endure the unimaginable. In this crucible of deprivation, the prisoners were forced to confront the very essence of human resilience. Amid the relentless grind of starvation and fear, small sparks of ingenuity and camaraderie flickered in the barracks, fragile yet vital. In a world where each meal was a battle, and every day a negotiation with death, survival became a collective effort, and the bonds forged in adversity were as crucial as any rationed bite of food. The prisoners quickly learned that life could only be sustained not through brute endurance alone, but through collaboration, shared knowledge, and the subtle art of improvisation. One of the earliest forms of cooperation involved the capture and preparation of rats. Soldiers who had discovered effective trapping methods quietly taught their techniques to others, sharing tips on how to bait a trap or how to cook the meat without burning it. "We were all desperate," one veteran later wrote, "but in that desperation we found purpose in helping one another. Every rat caught, every leaf boiled, was a small triumph shared." Simple gestures, handing over a wormy root, offering advice on a cooking technique, became lifelines, both physical and emotional. Foraging for edible weeds and plants also became a communal effort. Soldiers mapped the campgrounds in hushed whispers, noting which patches of greenery were safe, which roots were nourishing, and which berries could be eaten without consequence. Some men took it upon themselves to memorize the locations of edible plants, guiding others through the undergrowth under the cover of dawn or dusk. These excursions were fraught with risk, guards patrolled with an unpredictable watchfulness, but the soldiers' shared knowledge and careful coordination allowed them to return with modest but vital sustenance. Beyond food, ingenuity extended to small tricks that preserved sanity and health. Men would collect rainwater in discarded containers, filter it through cloth to reduce impurities, or trade minor favors, in exchange for scraps of soap or cloth to treat sores and infections. Some soldiers devised ways to stretch the tiniest amounts of broth, diluting it carefully and simmering weeds alongside it to extract every possible nutrient. One diary recounts a soldier's pride in making a single rat feed 3 of us for a day. by the grace of patience and fire. Such resourcefulness was a quiet rebellion against the camp's system of scarcity, a way to reclaim control in a world designed to strip it away. Camaraderie extended to emotional survival as well. Men told stories from home, whispered jokes that broke through the oppressive silence, and shared memories of better days. Letters exchanged in secret provided hope, and whispered accounts of family meals became mental sustenance, feeding imagination and determination when the body could not. In a camp designed to reduce men to husks of hunger and fear, these shared rituals maintained a sense of humanity, a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, they were still men with minds, hearts, and memories. Humor, dark and often macabre, became a vital coping mechanism. Soldiers would mock the taste of weeds, exaggerate their distaste for rats, or hold mock feasts with invisible menus, drawing laughter from those on the brink of collapse. These moments, though brief, offered critical relief from the unending pressure of starvation. In the cruel calculus of survival, morale was just as important as nutrition, and laughter, tiny, desperate laughter, could mean the difference between despair and endurance. Perhaps most striking was the way in which these survival tricks and acts of camaraderie transformed the prisoner's perspective on life and death. The men came to understand that survival was not merely a personal endeavor, but a collective one. Sharing a meal, teaching a skill, offering comfort, these small, deliberate acts of solidarity ensured that more men lived to see another day. Even in a camp dominated by deprivation, cruelty, and fear, the human spirit persisted, creative, resilient, and stubbornly alive. The prisoners soon realized that hunger was not their only adversary. In the damp, overcrowded barracks, disease spread like wildfire, exploiting every weakness in their bodies. Lice crawled across emaciated skin, their bites causing unbearable itching and open sores. Dysentery struck with sudden, violent force, leaving men doubled over in agony, weak and dehydrated. Scurvy, a silent predator born of vitamin deficiency, made gums bleed, teeth loosen, and bodies fracture under the relentless strain. Each illness was a cruel companion to starvation, compounding suffering and pushing the men closer to the edge of endurance. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Water was often stagnant or contaminated, latrines overflowed, and vermin scuttled freely among the barracks. Even the most disciplined soldiers were not immune to the resulting infections. Simple scratches became dangerous, turning into abscesses or festering wounds, and minor illnesses could spiral into life-threatening conditions. One diary entry recalls a soldier tending to his comrade. "I washed his hands in the same filthy water we all drank, knowing it could kill him faster than hunger, but we had no choice." Every act of care was a risk, a delicate balance between sustaining life and exposing it to further harm. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, made the soldiers' bodies fragile. Muscles wasted, skin thinned, and immune systems collapsed under the combined weight of starvation and filth. Even minor exposure to disease became catastrophic. Fever became commonplace, turning sleep into a restless, fitful ordeal, while the mind wavered between delirium and despair. Soldiers reported hallucinations, not only from hunger, but also from infection. Shadows became enemies. The wind whispered threats, and familiar faces sometimes seemed distorted, almost grotesque. The human body, already stretched to its limits, began to phase, ill under the compounded pressures of illness and malnutrition. Medical care such as it existed was rudimentary at best. The few supplies were hoarded or rationed, leaving sick men to rely on one another for support. Improvised remedies, herbs, boiled water, crude bandages, were applied with care but rarely provided full relief. The psychological strain of watching a fellow prisoner weaken or die was nearly as devastating as the physical hardship. Soldiers recorded the slow deterioration of friends, the quiet, almost ceremonial nature of death in the barracks, and the resilience required merely to witness it without succumbing to despair. Disease also affected morale. The constant presence of sickness reinforced the perception that the camp was a place designed to destroy rather than merely contain its prisoners. It was a reminder that survival depended not only on cunning and endurance, but also on luck, on avoiding the invisible threats that could strike unpredictably and without warning. A minor infection could undo weeks of careful foraging and rationing, proving that even the most disciplined men were ultimately at the mercy of their environment. Yet, amidst the filth and fever, ingenuity continued to flourish. Soldiers devised ways to isolate the sick, shared knowledge about which plants or weeds might offer medicinal benefit, and performed small acts of hygiene with whatever materials they could scrounge. Even in the face of near-constant illness, the prisoners adapted, demonstrating a remarkable resilience. Survival became a delicate interplay of strategy, observation, and human ingenuity, a daily battle against both the visible and invisible forces of the camp. Letters written in the camp's later recollections illustrate the duality of experience. We fought starvation, yes, but we also fought disease. And sometimes it was the sickness that threatened to take us first. Yet we endured, somehow clinging to life in whatever small way we could. The horrors of infection, when combined with relentless hunger, made each day a testament to the sheer human will to survive. The guards patrolled the camp with an air of calculated menace, rifles slung across their shoulders, boots striking the hard-packed earth with rhythmic authority. Every movement of the prisoners was observed, every whisper noted, and every misstep punished with swift and often brutal severity. In this environment where hunger and disease already weakened the men, the guards became an omnipresent force of fear, their power magnified by the prisoners' inability to defend themselves. The clash between survival instinct and imposed authority was constant, and each confrontation tested both courage and restraint. Punishments were often arbitrary. A soldier caught lingering too long by the latrine, another suspected of hoarding a scrap of food, or even a man whose gaze lingered too long on the guards could face beatings, forced labor, or solitary confinement. The guards' methods were designed to strip prisoners of autonomy, to remind them of the absolute control held over their lives. Yet the prisoners learned quickly that survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on psychological acuity, anticipating rules, reading moods, and navigating the thin line between compliance and rebellion. Incidents of defiance were rare but revealing. One soldier, caught stealing a handful of weeds from a nearby patch, faced the jeers of the guards but survived because comrades had hidden portions of food in secret. Another tried to barter with a guard, offering labor in exchange for an extra scrap of food. The negotiations were tense and fraught with danger. One misstep could mean immediate retribution. Yet even in these interactions, the prisoners' ingenuity emerged. They learned to use distraction, timing, and subtle persuasion to survive, turning every encounter into a test of wit as well as courage. The presence of guards also heightened the tension during foraging or rat-cacks expeditions. Men had to move with stealth, sometimes under cover of night or behind bushes, risking punishment or worse for a few leaves or a captured rat. The fear of discovery made even the act of obtaining food an ordeal, and yet it also instilled a remarkable sense of resourcefulness. Soldiers learned to improvise traps quietly, cook swiftly, and conceal both their efforts and their spoils from prying eyes. Every small victory was a triumph of human ingenuity against oppressive power. Punishments were not merely physical, they were deeply psychological. Public shaming was common. A soldier forced to stand in the sun while others watched, or made to clean latrines with bare hands, became a cautionary tale for the rest. These rituals reinforced the guards' authority and magnified the constant stress the prisoners endured. Yet paradoxically, they also reinforced solidarity. Witnessing the suffering of one man often prompted others to share resources, exchange knowledge, or quietly support him in the days following, a subtle form of resistance against the camp's attempts to isolate and degrade. The cruelty of the guards was amplified by the prisoners' awareness of their own vulnerability. Hunger had already weakened the body. Illness and exhaustion made it almost impossible to resist. Every punishment reminded them that survival was precarious, dependent not only on food and ingenuity, but on navigating the constant threat of violence. Some men succumbed to despair, while others hardened, learning to anticipate danger and protect both themselves and their comrades. Despite the fear, acts of defiance and cunning persisted. Men hid small portions of food, traded information about guards' patrol patterns, and developed signals to warn each other of approaching danger. These small acts of rebellion, though subtle, became essential to survival. They reinforced a quiet, shared understanding that even in the strictest hierarchy of power, human creativity and solidarity could carve out a sliver of autonomy. By the end of this stage, the prisoners had learned a stark truth. Survival depended not just on food or ingenuity, but on an acute awareness of authority, timing, and human behavior. The guard's presence was relentless, but so too was the human capacity to endure, adapt, and resist, even in the most confined and threatening circumstances. In the darkest hours of the camp, when the gnawing of hunger seemed unending and the weight of despair pressed heavily on every man, letters and memories became lifelines. Handwritten notes, smuggled scraps of paper, and memories whispered between prisoners offered a bridge to a world that seemed impossibly distant. The homes they had left behind, the families they longed to see, the comforts of normal life that had been stripped away. These fragile tokens of the past became both refuge and fuel, sustaining the spirit when the body could scarcely be nourished. Soldiers would pass letters quietly among themselves, reading aloud snippets to keep morale alive. Even the faintest recollection of home, a mother's smile, the scent of baked bread, the sound of a sister laughing, provided fleeting warmth against the cold, damp barracks. "We lived on memories," one diary recalled, "and for a moment it was enough to fill our stomachs with hope, if not with food." The act of remembering became a survival skill, a way to momentarily transcend the hunger, filth, and cruelty that defined their days. Letters from home, when they arrived, were precious and rare. A folded envelope could bring news of births, weddings, or small triumphs, a reminder that life continued beyond the barbed wire. Some soldiers kept these letters close, hiding them under planks of wood or inside clothing, reading them repeatedly when the weight of the camp threatened to crush their resolve. The words of loved ones became more than comfort. They were reminders of purpose, of the life that awaited beyond the gates. Even when letters were not available, memories served a similar function. Soldiers recounted shared experiences of laughter, training exercises, or moments of camaraderie before capture. These recollections, shared in hushed voices late at night, became rituals of connection, anchoring the men to a sense of identity beyond the emaciated, fevered bodies they now inhabited. The collective storytelling also reinforced solidarity, a reminder that even in the relentless pressure of starvation, they were not entirely alone. Some memories were bittersweet, blending nostalgia with grief. Recalling a family dinner could trigger both comfort and anguish, a reminder of the food and abundance now denied them. Soldiers wrote of missing the simplest meals, of butter on bread or the taste of fresh fruit, sensations now replaced by rats, boiled weeds, and the thin, bitter broth that defined camp life. The juxtaposition of past abundance with present scarcity was a recurring source of psychological strain, yet also a motivator. The hope of one day returning to that world provided a glimmer of resilience. Diaries and letters also reveal the soldiers' attempts to maintain dignity and morality. They wrote of promises made to themselves and to one another, to share food, to look after the weakest, to endure without losing the humanity that the camp sought to erode. These written and verbal oaths became more than words. They were a framework of ethical survival, a means of asserting control over a world that sought to render them powerless. Even in the bleakest moments, letters and memories could spark quiet defiance. Reading about life beyond the camp inspired men to take risks in foraging, to endure punishments with a sense of purpose, and to persist in acts of ingenuity that kept the entire group alive. The human mind, nourished by recollection and hope, became a powerful ally, sometimes as vital as a single leaf or a captured rat. Ultimately, Letters and memories served as a bridge between two worlds, the world they had lost and the world they hoped to regain. They reminded the men that starvation could threaten the body, but it could not completely conquer the spirit. In the silent corners of the barracks, surrounded by suffering and deprivation, these fragments of the past provided a fragile but essential source of sustenance, keeping hope alive amid despair. As the days and weeks dragged on in the camp, the prisoners developed an array of coping mechanisms, both practical and psychological, to endure the relentless pressures of starvation, disease, and oppression. Survival had become a multi-dimensional struggle, not merely against hunger or illness, but against despair itself. Each man found ways, often improvised and deeply personal, to preserve not only his life, but the fragile remnants of his mind and dignity. Routine became a cornerstone of psychological endurance. Soldiers imposed small schedules on themselves, waking at the first light, performing essential chores, dividing the day between foraging, resting, and observing the guards' patterns. Even the simplest acts, sharpening a stick for a trap, cleaning a makeshift bedding area, or tending a hidden stash of weeds, provided a sense of control in an environment deliberately designed to remove it. The predictability of routine offered stability, however tenuous, in a world dominated by chaos. Humor, dark and ironic, emerged as another vital tool. Soldiers laughed at the absurdity of their situation, joking about the taste of weeds, the texture of rat meat, or the ineptitude of some guards. Even fleeting moments of shared laughter were enough to remind the men of their humanity, to break the oppressive tension that could otherwise become unbearable. One soldier noted, "We laughed because if we didn't, we would have cried, and crying was too dangerous in this place." Humor became a shield, deflecting despair long enough to gather strength for another day. Rituals of personal hygiene, scarce though resources were, also played a significant role. Soldiers washed in the same contaminated rivers used for drinking, carefully removing lice with small combs or their fingers. Cleaning one's body, however meager the results, became an act of defiance, a statement that the camp could not completely reduce them to vermin. Similarly, tending small portions of food, carefully sharing rat meat or weeds, and creating improvised stoves or cooking implements provided both nourishment and a sense of purpose. These small rituals anchored the prisoners to the concept of order and self-respect in a world dominated by deprivation. Mental exercises were equally crucial. Soldiers read or recited letters and memories, visualized meals from home, or rehearsed survival strategies in their minds. These acts of imagination, though intangible, had tangible effects on morale. They provided mental nourishment when physical sustenance was insufficient, and allowed men to maintain a connection to their identity beyond the emaciated, fevered bodies the camp had created. Camaraderie, more than anything, served as a lifeline. Men shared knowledge, rationed scarce food, and offered comfort in whispered words or a supportive touch. The emotional bonds forged in shared suffering became crucial to resilience. Soldiers who might otherwise have succumbed to despair found strength in the collective, drawing courage from the quiet determination of their peers. This solidarity, sometimes expressed through practical assistance, sometimes through moral support, became one of the most reliable coping mechanisms in the camp. Some coping strategies were born of necessity, such as rationing scraps, planning for future meals, or hiding portions of food for emergencies. Others were psychological, such as dissociation, mentally separating from the pain and focusing solely on survival tasks, or humor, imagination, and storytelling. Together, these strategies allowed prisoners to endure conditions that would have broken those less adaptive. By combining physical, emotional, and cognitive coping mechanisms, the soldiers carved out a fragile but critical space of resilience. Each day was a battle, not only against hunger and illness, but against the psychological assault of captivity. And though the mechanisms varied from man to man, from whispered prayer to crude humor, from meticulous routine to imaginative flights of memory, they shared a singular purpose: to endure, to survive, and to maintain the spark of humanity in a place designed to extinguish it. The barracks were silent except for the occasional cough, the scratching of lice, or the distant, rhythmic clatter of guards' boots. In the dim morning light, the prisoners' bodies seemed almost skeletal. Sunken eyes, protruding ribs, limbs reduced to thin, trembling shadows of their former strength. Hunger had become an omnipresent predator, gnawing not just at the stomach, but at the very essence of vitality. Many soldiers teetered on the edge of death, their willpower the only barrier between life and oblivion. One soldier recalled lying motionless on the floor, unable to muster the energy to rise. For days he had survived only on a few boiled weeds and the occasional rat captured in a trap, the thin protein barely enough to sustain the failing muscles in his legs. "I remember thinking I would not wake," he later wrote. "My body felt empty, a hollow vessel, and yet, somehow, I did." Another recounted fainting mid-foraging, only to be dragged back to the barracks by comrades who shared what little food they had, whispering encouragement and refusing to let him surrender to the darkness. These near-death experiences were punctuated by moments that highlighted the thin margin between survival and collapse. Rats, once objects of horror, became literal saviors, providing the protein necessary to stave off starvation long enough for recovery. Weeds and wild roots, once discarded in disgust, now offered vital sustenance, each mouthful a small victory over the encroaching specter of death. Even the smallest calorie mattered. A single boiled root, a handful of leaves, could mean the difference between collapsing and dragging oneself toward the next day. Hunger-induced delirium blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Soldiers described seeing feasts, hearing the clatter of imaginary kitchens, and sensing scents that were not there. Each hallucination carried with it both torment and relief, a cruel mockery of the fullness they had lost, and a temporary mental reprieve from the relentless gnawing of starvation. It was in these moments, suspended between consciousness and collapse, that the prisoner's resilience became both a marvel and a tragedy. Despite the extreme suffering, acts of solidarity repeatedly saved lives. Comrades shared the last scraps, guided one another to edible plants, or encouraged each other to endure another night. Survival was rarely an individual achievement. It was the quiet interdependence among men facing identical desperation that kept many alive. By the time these soldiers had passed the brink, they were forever changed, their bodies scarred, their minds haunted, but their will unbroken. The near-death experiences served as a stark reminder of the extremity of their ordeal. In the barren barracks, among the sick and emaciated, life clung to them by the thinnest threads woven from ingenuity, courage, and the unyielding instinct to survive. Hunger, once an abstract threat, had become a tangible force, capable of reshaping morality, behavior, and perception, leaving indelible marks on all who endured it. The sudden arrival of Allied forces was like a surge of impossible light after a lifetime in shadow. Soldiers awoke to the unfamiliar sound of marching, the hum of engines, and the distant shouts of liberators. Barbed wire and guard towers, once symbols of relentless oppression, seemed to dissolve under the morning sun. For the prisoners, it was a surreal moment, relief mingled with disbelief, joy tempered by the lingering numbness of months of deprivation. Many stood rooted, staring at the liberators as though they were phantoms, unable to fully comprehend that freedom had arrived. Food, once scarce and suspect, now became an overwhelming challenge. Prisoners, long conditioned to fear hunger and ration, approached meals cautiously. Some gagged at the richness of bread, milk, and fresh meat. Others ate with a desperate abandon that sent their weakened bodies into shock. The psychological adjustment was as demanding as the physical one. Years of scarcity had reshaped their appetite, metabolism, and relationship with food. One soldier remembered, "I held the bread in my hands, trembling, afraid to take a bite. When I finally did, it was like tasting life itself, yet my body rebelled against such abundance." Medical teams quickly assessed the survivors, shocked by the scale of malnutrition, disease, and physical deterioration. Bodies that had survived months of extreme deprivation required careful rehabilitation. Too much food, too quickly, could be fatal. Nutritional recovery became a delicate process, each meal carefully calculated, each intervention monitored. Yet even amid the clinical procedures, there was joy. The small victories of consuming a proper meal, regaining strength, and feeling warmth and comfort again were profound milestones. Psychological trauma, however, lingered. Soldiers who had clawed their way through starvation carried invisible scars, nightmares returned, often triggered by smells or sounds reminiscent of the camp. Memories of fellow prisoners who had perished haunted the liberated men, as did guilt over survival. Why had some lived while others had not? The liberation, while triumphant, was not an instantaneous cure. It marked the beginning of a complex journey of healing, both physically and emotionally. Yet liberation also offered perspective. In letters home and post-war memoirs, survivors reflected on the extremes they endured, on the ingenuity and solidarity that kept them alive, and on the profound fragility and resilience of human life. Rats, weeds, and a meager broth were no longer just symbols of horror. They were reminders of endurance, resourcefulness, and the unyielding will to survive. The trauma of starvation remained, but so did a quiet reverence for life and the bonds that had allowed them to cling to it. Rats and weeds, two words that in ordinary life might evoke disgust or dismissal. But for the men trapped behind barbed wire, emaciated, weakened, and on the brink of death, they were salvation. They were the thin line between life and oblivion, the fragile bridge upon which the human will to survive balanced itself. Hunger had transformed everything, warping morality, testing ingenuity, and exposing the rawest depths of human endurance. What once seemed unthinkable, the capture, the consumption, the constant negotiation with scarcity, became the very definition of survival. Looking back, it is staggering to consider the extremes these men endured. Each day, they faced a cruel calculus: eat or die, act or collapse, hope or surrender. Their emaciated frames, sunken eyes, and trembling limbs tell one story. Their resilience, camaraderie, and ingenuity tell another. It was not merely the physical struggle against hunger and disease, nor the psychological battle against despair and hallucination. It was both simultaneously a total test of human adaptability and determination. The camp stripped men to their most basic needs, yet the very act of survival demanded extraordinary creativity, courage, and endurance. Letters, diaries, and photographs capture this paradox with haunting clarity. One letter, preserved decades later, recounts a soldier carefully teaching a comrade to trap rats. Another describes the delicate preparation of boiled roots to sustain a small group through another day. In survivor interviews, men speak of humor in the barracks, whispered advice, and small rituals that became anchors of humanity. The cinematic montage of these documents paints a picture of men surviving not just through luck or brute strength, but through ingenuity, adaptability, and shared determination. Even the simplest acts, catching a rat, boiling a weed, sharing a scrap of food, took on profound significance. They were victories over deprivation, affirmations of life in a world designed to crush it. Each meal consumed, no matter how grotesque or humble, was a testament to the human capacity to adapt, to endure, and to reclaim agency in the most powerless circumstances. Survival became both a physical and moral endeavor. Men had to navigate fear, disgust, and ethical compromise to sustain themselves and one another. The story of these prisoners reminds us of the fragility and strength of human life. It illuminates how desperation can drive innovation, how solidarity can sustain the individual against overwhelming odds, and how the human spirit can cling to hope even when everything else has been stripped away. Rats and weeds, symbols of horror, disgust, and deprivation, were transformed into instruments of resilience and endurance, proof that life persists in the most unlikely forms. In the end, The legacy of their ordeal is both sobering and inspiring. These men survived not because the world was merciful, but because the human will is unyielding, capable of adapting to extremes that would seem unimaginable in ordinary life. The memory of their struggle serves as a testament to the unbreakable bond between ingenuity, courage, and survival, the quiet, relentless determination to cling to life against all odds. Even now, decades later, when letters are read, photographs studied, and survivor interviews recalled, the lesson remains clear. The human spirit, when confronted with the unimaginable, finds a way. Rats and weeds, what once seemed unthinkable, became the difference between life and death, a stark and unforgettable illustration of the extraordinary resilience of those who endured. The story of men surviving on rats and weeds is a stark reminder of just how extreme the human will to survive can be. Starvation, disease, and cruelty pushed these soldiers to unimaginable limits, and yet through ingenuity, solidarity, and sheer determination, they endured. Their ordeal forces us to confront the fragility of life, the resourcefulness of the human mind, and the lengths we can go to cling to existence when all seems lost. If you thought this story was unbelievable, the next video reveals another shocking survival tale from WWII, one that tests both morality and endurance in ways even more extreme. From the forgotten corners of history, these stories shed light on the human spirit under the harshest conditions, revealing truths that were nearly lost to time. Don't miss it. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to uncover the next hidden truth of WWII. These are the stories they didn't want you to know, the experiences that history almost forgot, but the lessons they leave behind are unforgettable.